My father had just been buried when my stepbrother pulled me aside in the cemetery parking lot. I thought he wanted to talk about family, about grief, about what came next. Instead, he fired me. No warning, no conversation, just a quiet explanation that my role wasn't necessary anymore. After 10 years helping build the company my father started from nothing, I was suddenly locked out of the place that had defined most of my adult life. But what my stepbrother didn't know was that my father had quietly prepared for something like this. And 3 weeks later, a single boardroom meeting would change everything. The morning of my father's funeral felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a house feels after a storm has passed, but the air still carries the weight of what happened. I stood near the edge of the cemetery, hands folded in front of me, watching the small crowd gather around the casket. The sky was gray, the kind of dull winter light that makes everything look a little drained of color. My father had always liked simple things, so the service was modest. No grand speeches, no big display, just family, a few longtime employees from the company, and people who had known him for decades. I barely heard most of what the pastor said. Grief does strange things to time. Moments stretch and collapse at the same time. 1 second I was staring at the polished wood of the casket, remembering my dad standing behind his desk in that old office, sleeves rolled up, explaining balance sheets like they were stories. The next moment, people were already placing flowers and quietly stepping away. When the service ended, people approached one by one. Your father was a good man. He built something special. He was proud of you. I nodded, shook hands, thanked them. It all felt automatic, like I was reading lines from a script someone else had written. Eventually, the crowd began thinning out. Cars pulled away from the gravel road one at a time. My stepmother left with a few relatives, her arm linked tightly with her sister's. That's when my stepbrother Daniel approached. He hadn't spoken much during the service. In fact, I'd barely seen him. But now he walked toward me with a kind of purpose that felt off. Hey, he said quietly. I nodded. Hey. For a moment we both just stood there, the wind brushing through the bare branches above us. Then he cleared his throat. Listen, he said. We should probably talk. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. About what? I asked. Business. I glanced back toward the grave, the fresh mound of earth still dark against the pale grass. Today? I said. He shifted his weight slightly, like he'd already rehearsed the conversation. Yeah, he replied. It's better to just handle it now. We walked a few steps away from the others, toward the edge of the parking area where only a few cars remained. Daniel rubbed his hands together like he was cold, though the temperature wasn't that bad. Then he looked straight at me. I'm going to be direct, he said. With Dad gone, we're making some changes at the company. I waited. He took a breath. We've decided your role isn't really necessary anymore. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. My role? I said. Yeah, he continued quickly. We're restructuring leadership, streamlining things. The words sounded polished. Prepared. You're firing me, I said. He hesitated, then nodded. I wouldn't phrase it like that, but yeah. I stared at him. Just a few minutes earlier, we had been standing over our father's grave. You're doing this today? I asked quietly. Daniel avoided my eyes for the first time. It's just business, he said. The sentence landed like a stone. I felt something inside me shift. Not anger exactly, not yet. Just a deep, hollow disbelief. I had spent more than a decade inside that company. Late nights, weekend projects, fixing problems no one else wanted to touch. And now I was being dismissed in a parking lot after my father's funeral. I exhaled slowly. Okay, I said. Daniel looked almost relieved. I'll have HR send you the paperwork, he added. Of course he would. I nodded once, then turned toward my car. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked away. Behind me, my father's grave sat quiet beneath the gray sky. And somewhere between those few steps across the parking lot, I realized something strange. In the span of one afternoon, I had lost my father, and my place in the life we had built together. I didn't plan to work for my father. In college, I imagined something different for myself. Maybe consulting, maybe finance in a bigger city. Somewhere fast-paced where no one knew my last name. Somewhere I wouldn't constantly hear people say, "You're Jim Carter's kid, right?" But life doesn't always follow the version you picture at 20. The summer after I graduated, my father invited me to lunch. Nothing fancy, just the same diner he'd been going to since before I was born. The waitress already knew what he wanted before he even sat down. He slid a folder across the table. "Take a look at this," he said. Inside were company reports, sales numbers, operational charts, a few notes scribbled in his handwriting. "I need help," he said simply. At the time, the company was stable but stuck. My father had built it from almost nothing over 30 years. He understood every customer, every supplier, every inch of the warehouse floor. But systems hadn't kept up. Everything lived in spreadsheets. Inventory tracking was half manual. Orders sometimes relied on phone calls instead of software. The kind of business structure that worked when the company was small but started to strain as it grew. "I know you've got options," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "But this place that matters to me." I remember looking around that diner while he talked. Truck drivers at the counter. 2 construction workers sharing a booth. The low hum of conversation mixed with the clink of coffee mugs. My father wasn't a man who asked for help easily. So when he did, I listened. "What exactly would I be doing?" I asked. He smiled a little. "Fixing things I don't understand anymore." That's how it started. At first, I was just the young guy with the laptop. I spent weeks mapping out how the company actually functioned, who handled what, where delays happened, where money quietly leaked through inefficient systems. Some of the older employees looked at me like I was trying to reinvent the wheel. But my dad never stopped backing me. If he says we're updating it, he'd tell people, then we're updating it. Over the next few years, we modernized almost everything. Inventory systems, vendor management, digital ordering, logistics tracking. The work wasn't glamorous. Most days were long and quiet, buried in spreadsheets, software rollouts, and operational headaches. But slowly things changed. Orders moved faster. Errors dropped. Profits climbed. And through all of it, my stepbrother Daniel stayed mostly on the leadership side, sales meetings, networking events, public-facing stuff. He had the title, Vice President, eventually Executive Director. I never cared much about titles. My father once joked about it during a late night in the office. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "people think Daniel runs this place." I shrugged. "As long as the work gets done." He studied me for a moment. "You carry more of this company than anyone realizes," he said quietly. But he never changed the structure. Publicly, Daniel remained the clear successor. Family politics are complicated like that. My stepmother was always proud of Daniel's position. At company events, she'd introduce him as the future of the business. Sometimes she'd gesture toward me afterward and say, "And, of course, he helps out with the technical side." Helps out. I used to smile when she said it, because the truth was I believed something simple. That loyalty mattered. That years of work meant something. And that when the time came, my father would make sure the people who actually built the company were the ones trusted to protect it. Looking back now, the warning signs were there long before my father passed. At the time, I ignored most of them. When you're focused on keeping a business running, deadlines, logistics, payroll cycles, you tend to push family tension into the background. You tell yourself it's temporary. that once things stabilize, the awkwardness will settle too. But things didn't settle. They shifted. It started when my father's health began to decline. At first it was small things. Fatigue. Doctor's appointments that showed up on his calendar more often than usual. He'd still come into the office, but he started leaving earlier in the afternoons. That's when my stepmother began appearing more frequently at the company. Not officially. She didn't have a role on paper, but she would sit in on meetings sometimes, especially the ones that involved long-term planning. The first time it happened, I remember glancing across the conference table at Daniel. He looked perfectly comfortable, like this had already been discussed. "Your father thought it would be good if I stayed informed," she said lightly when she noticed my expression. I nodded, though the explanation didn't quite land. My father had always kept a firm line between home and the business. But suddenly that line was blurry. A few months later I noticed something else. Meetings happening without me. Nothing dramatic. Just strategy discussions that I'd hear about afterward. New vendor negotiations I wasn't included in. Financial summaries arriving in my inbox after decisions had already been made. One afternoon, I walked into the conference room and saw Daniel and my stepmother sitting with two department heads. The conversation stopped when I entered. "Oh," Daniel said casually. "We were just wrapping up." I glanced at the documents on the table. Expansion proposals. Warehouse lease discussions. Things I normally handled. "Didn't know we had a meeting," I said. "It was last minute," he replied quickly. "Nothing major." But the room carried that strange, quiet people fall into when a conversation changes direction. Later that evening I mentioned it to my father. We were the only two left in the office, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights filling the space between us. "Daniel's stepping into more leadership," he said after a pause. I waited. "That's good," I said carefully. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the papers in front of him. "I just want to make sure the company stays steady," he added. There was something unfinished in the way he said it, like there were more words behind the ones he chose. In the following months, Daniel became more visible as the company's public face. He started leading investor calls. He represented us at industry conferences. People began referring to him as the next CEO, almost casually. Meanwhile, I stayed buried in the work itself, systems, contracts, operational planning. Part of me told myself this division made sense. Every company has visible leaders and people behind the structure. But occasionally I'd catch my father watching the office floor from the glass window outside his office. Quiet. Thoughtful. One night, not long before he stopped coming in regularly, he called me into his office. He looked tired, but his voice was steady. "Whatever happens," he said slowly, "remember something." I leaned forward slightly. "Protect what you helped build." I thought he meant the company. At the time, that seemed obvious. What I didn't realize then was that he might have been talking about something much more complicated than profit margins or warehouse expansions. He might have been warning me about the people already standing inside the building. The email arrived 2 hours after the funeral. I was sitting in my car outside my apartment building when my phone buzzed. For a moment, I assumed it was another condolence message. Someone from the company. Maybe an old client who had heard the news. Instead, I saw the sender. Human Resources. The subject line was short. Employment Status Update. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before opening it. The message itself was polite. Almost painfully polite. Following leadership restructuring, your position with Carter Industrial Group has been terminated effective immediately. There were paragraphs about transition procedures. Instructions regarding company property. A note explaining that HR would coordinate the return of my laptop and access credentials. It read like any ordinary corporate termination notice. Except for one thing. My father had been buried less than 3 hours earlier. I leaned back in the driver's seat and let out a slow breath. Daniel hadn't even waited until the end of the day. For a few minutes, I just sat there, watching people walk past on the sidewalk. A couple argued quietly near the building entrance. A delivery truck idled across the street. The world had already moved on. Finally, I started the car. The company office was only a 15-minute drive away. I told myself I'd just collect the few personal things I had left there: photos, notebooks, a jacket I kept hanging behind my chair. Nothing dramatic, just closure. The parking lot looked the same as it always had. Same rows of employee cars. Same loading dock activity behind the warehouse. But the moment I stepped inside the building, the air felt different. Word travels fast in companies. A few employees glanced up when I walked through the front hallway. Some offered small, sympathetic nods. Others quickly looked back at their computer screens. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. They already knew. I walked to my office slowly, noticing little details I had never paid attention to before. The scuff marks along the hallway floor, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the break room, the soft whir of the printers near accounting. The door to my office was unlocked. Inside, everything looked exactly as I had left it the day before the funeral. My desk. The whiteboard with half-erased logistics notes. The framed photo of my father and me standing outside the original warehouse 10 years earlier, both of us squinting into the sunlight. I picked it up for a moment, then I placed it carefully into a small box. One of the warehouse supervisors, Mark, appeared in the doorway after a few minutes. He had worked with my father for over 20 years. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey." He shifted his weight like he wasn't sure whether he should be there. "Just heard," he added. I nodded. "Yeah." Mark looked down the hallway before speaking again. "None of us expected it to happen like this." "I figured," I said. There was a long pause. "Well," he said finally, you know where to find us." It wasn't a big speech. Mark wasn't that kind of person. But the words meant something. After he left, I finished packing the last few things into the box. Company laptop. Notebooks. A mug someone had given me years ago that said "World's Okayest Manager." When I reached the front desk, the receptionist looked up nervously. "Your key card," she said softly. I slid it across the counter. She placed it into a small envelope like it was evidence in a courtroom. Then I walked back out into the afternoon light. The office doors closed quietly behind me. For the first time in over a decade, I no longer worked at the company my father had spent his entire life building. 3 days after the funeral, my phone rang while I was making coffee in my kitchen. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. The last few days had been filled with calls, condolences, awkward check-ins, distant relatives suddenly remembering they existed. But something made me answer. "Hello." "Good morning," a calm voice said. "Is this Michael Carter?" "Yes." "My name is Thomas Ellery. I'm the estate attorney who handled your father's legal affairs." I paused. My father had always kept his legal work very private. I knew he had an attorney, of course, but I had never actually spoken to him. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ellery continued. "I know this is not an easy time." "Thank you," I said. There was a brief pause, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "I was hoping we could schedule a meeting," he said. "There are some documents related to your father's estate that require your review." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Shouldn't that involve Daniel too?" I asked. "It will," Ellery replied. "But there are certain matters that concern you specifically." That sentence lingered in the air. "All right," I said slowly. "When?" We agreed to meet the following morning at his office downtown. Ellery's office occupied the top floor of a quiet brick building that looked older than most of the businesses around it. Inside, everything felt deliberately calm. Dark wood furniture, shelves of legal books, soft lighting that made the room feel almost insulated from the outside world. Ellery himself was older than I expected, probably late 60s, with silver hair and a kind of steady patience in the way he spoke. After we sat down, he opened a thick folder. "Your father updated several aspects of his estate roughly 8 months ago," he said. I nodded. "That's not unusual," he continued. "Major business owners often restructure things when their health changes." He slid a document across the desk toward me. At first it looked like any standard legal agreement. Ownership tables, share distributions, voting structures. My eyes skimmed the page once, then again. "Wait," I said quietly. Ellery folded his hands. "Yes." According to the document, my father had reorganized the company's shares into a layered ownership structure. Daniel held a significant portion. My stepmother held another. But I held something else entirely. A large minority stake. Far larger than I had ever expected. "I didn't know about this," I said. "That was intentional," Ellery replied. I looked up. "Your father believed certain protections worked best when they were unexpected." I studied the numbers again. Even without controlling ownership, my share of the company was substantial. Large enough to matter in every major vote. Large enough that removing me from operations should have triggered questions. "There's more," Ellery said. He opened another section of the folder. "These shares are tied to several governance clauses." "What kind of clauses?" "Performance and conduct provisions for executive leadership." The language was dense, but the meaning slowly became clear. Certain executive decisions, particularly those involving the dismissal of founding partners or major operational leaders, could activate review mechanisms within the ownership structure. In simple terms, the company's leadership couldn't just remove key people without consequences. I sat back in the chair. "Daniel didn't know about this, did he?" Ellery gave a faint smile. "Your father preferred to reveal information when it became necessary." The room went quiet. For the first time since that conversation in the cemetery parking lot, the feeling inside my chest shifted. The hollow disbelief that had followed me for days started to fade. Not into anger, not into revenge, into something calmer, something steadier. Because for the first time since my father's funeral, I realized I wasn't nearly as powerless as Daniel believed. The strange thing about losing your job overnight is how quiet life becomes afterward. For more than 10 years, my days had followed the same rhythm. Early mornings reviewing reports, midday meetings, late evenings fixing whatever operational problem had surfaced that week. Then suddenly, none of it was mine anymore. The first few mornings after the meeting with Ellery, I still woke up at 6 out of habit. My body hadn't yet realized that the routine was gone. I'd make coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and stare at my laptop. But instead of internal dashboards and logistics spreadsheets, I was looking at the company from the outside. Press releases, industry newsletters, public announcements. Daniel moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the company issued a statement about new leadership direction. It praised my father's legacy, emphasized continuity, and introduced Daniel as the primary executive voice moving forward. My name wasn't mentioned. At first, I told myself that was probably intentional. Companies often avoid discussing internal departures publicly. Still, it felt strange. I had spent a decade inside those walls. Now I existed nowhere in the official story. A few days later, I noticed something else. Daniel had announced an aggressive expansion plan. 2 new distribution contracts. A warehouse lease in another state. Marketing partnerships with companies we had never worked with before. On paper, it looked bold. But bold decisions can also be reckless ones. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an old coworker.
"Mark,
You watching what's happening over here?" I stared at the message for a moment before replying. Some of it. 3 dots appeared immediately. Things are moving fast, he wrote. Too fast. I could picture him standing somewhere in the warehouse, phone tucked discreetly in his hand while forklifts hummed in the background. What kind of fast? I asked. There was a pause before his next message. Contracts getting signed before operations signs off. Vendors confused about new pricing structures. People upstairs acting like numbers don't matter. That last sentence stuck with me. Numbers had always mattered to my father. Not because he loved spreadsheets, but because numbers told the truth about a business. They revealed whether something was stable or slowly cracking beneath the surface. Over the following weeks, small bits of information reached me from different directions. A supplier who casually mentioned delayed payments. A logistics partner asking if I knew why our ordering system had suddenly changed procedures. Even a former client who called to say Daniel had promised shipping timelines that didn't match the company's actual capacity. None of these issues were catastrophic on their own. But businesses rarely collapse because of one big mistake. They weaken through a series of smaller ones. One evening I sat at my desk reviewing public financial filings. The revenue projections Daniel had announced looked optimistic. Very optimistic. I leaned back in my chair and thought about something my father used to say whenever new managers got excited about expansion. Growth is easy, he'd tell them. Control is the hard part. The question circling my mind wasn't about Daniel's ambition. Ambition can be useful. The real question was whether the company still had someone inside it who understood the difference between movement and stability. I closed the laptop and stared out the window for a long time, because watching from the outside had created a different kind of problem. For the first time, I had distance. And distance sometimes shows you things that are harder to see when you're standing in the middle of the room. Which meant I now faced a decision I hadn't expected. Whether stepping back was the respectful thing to do, or whether staying silent would allow the company my father built to slowly drift into decisions it might not survive. A week after I started noticing the cracks, I called Thomas Ellery again. I think I need to understand those clauses a little better, I told him. He didn't sound surprised. Come by tomorrow morning, he said. Bring whatever questions you have. Ellery's office felt familiar now, quiet, steady, the opposite of the chaos that seemed to be forming inside the company. When I sat down across from him, the same thick folder from our last meeting was already on the desk. I assume something has changed, he said. Not exactly changed, I replied. More like revealed itself. He nodded slightly. Tell me. I explained what I'd been seeing from the outside. Daniel's rapid expansion plans, vendors expressing confusion, operational shortcuts. Ellery listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened the folder and turned a few pages until he reached a section marked with a small tab. This, he said, tapping the document gently, is the clause I mentioned before. I leaned forward. The language was dense. Legal writing tends to bury meaning under layers of precision. But Ellery translated it in plain English. Your father created a governance safeguard, he explained. If certain executive decisions threaten the operational stability of the company, minority shareholders with sufficient stake can request a formal board review. That doesn't sound unusual, I said. It isn't, he agreed. What makes this different is the second half. He slid another document across the desk. This clause also protects founding operational partners. I read the phrase twice. That's me, I said quietly. Yes. My father had listed specific individuals whose roles were considered structurally critical to the company's function. My name was there. If one of those partners is removed without cause, Ellery continued, it can trigger a governance review. And what happens during that review? He folded his hands calmly. The board evaluates whether executive leadership acted against the company's best interests. I looked down at the papers again. And if they decide it did? Ellery's voice remained steady. Ownership shares tied to executive authority can be redistributed. The sentence landed heavier than the legal language suggested. Redistributed how? In extreme cases, he said, control transfers to the shareholder best positioned to stabilize the company. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I thought back to that conversation in the cemetery parking lot. Daniel standing there, explaining my role wasn't necessary anymore. I had assumed it was personal. Now, I realized something else. He hadn't just removed an employee. He had removed someone the ownership structure considered essential to the company's operations. Did Daniel know about this clause? I asked. Ellery gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Your father did not make a habit of advertising contingency mechanisms. I leaned back in the chair. So firing me could actually trigger the review. Yes. And if the board agrees the decision damaged the company. Ellery nodded once. Your shares convert into a controlling interest. The numbers from the ownership table flashed in my mind again. 81%. Control. The room fell silent. For several seconds I stared at the documents, feeling the weight of the possibilities settle slowly into place. Finally, I looked up. This would destroy Daniel, I said. Ellery didn't react. My responsibility, he said carefully, is to explain the legal structure your father put in place. I nodded. I understood that. But legal structures don't carry emotional consequences. People do. For the next few minutes, we talked through the mechanics. What evidence would be required, how a board review would be called, what timeline the process would follow. When the conversation ended, Ellery closed the folder. You should take some time before making any decisions, he said. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the street below. Cars moved through the intersection like nothing unusual existed in the world. But inside that quiet office, something important had shifted. Because I had walked into the meeting thinking I might have influence. Instead, I had walked out realizing something far more complicated. I wasn't just a shareholder watching events unfold. If I chose to act, I had the power to take control of the company my father built. Walking back into the building felt different the second time. The first time, I had carried a cardboard box and the quiet understanding that I didn't belong there anymore. This time, I carried a leather folder and an invitation. The board meeting had been scheduled 3 weeks earlier after Ellery formally submitted the governance review request. Legally, the company had to address it, which meant Daniel couldn't ignore it. When I stepped through the glass entrance doors, the receptionist looked up with the same nervous expression I remembered from the day I turned in my keycard. But this time she didn't ask for anything. Good morning, she said carefully. Morning. A few employees walking through the hallway slowed down when they saw me. Not in a dramatic way, just that subtle hesitation people have when they realize something unexpected is happening. Word had already spread. Board meetings always carry rumors. And a governance review? That was the kind of phrase people whispered about behind closed office doors. The conference room was at the end of the hallway. When I walked in, several board members were already seated. Most of them had known my father for years, some even longer than I had been working at the company. They greeted me politely, but there was a seriousness in the room that hadn't existed during our usual quarterly meetings. At the far end of the table, Daniel sat with his arms folded. He looked confident, but there was tension in the way his jaw tightened when he saw me. Well, he said flatly, this should be interesting. I didn't respond. Instead, I took my seat across from him and placed the folder on the table. The meeting began a few minutes later when Ellery entered the room. As the company's legal counsel for the estate and governance structure, he had been asked to present the review. He spoke calmly, methodically, like a professor explaining a complex problem. The purpose of this meeting, he said, is to evaluate whether recent executive decisions have compromised the operational stability of Carter Industrial Group. No one interrupted. The board members listened as Ellery outlined the sequence of events. My termination, the restructuring announcement, the expansion contracts Daniel had signed, then the financial projections. Several spreadsheets appeared on the screen at the end of the room. Revenue expectations, vendor commitments, logistics capacity. Numbers rarely lie. And these numbers told a story. One board member leaned forward. Daniel, he said carefully, did operations sign off on these expansion agreements? Daniel shifted in his chair. We didn't need operational approval, he replied. We needed momentum. Another board member spoke next. Momentum without infrastructure can damage a company. Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. With respect, the company needs growth. My father ran it conservatively for decades. I felt something stir at that sentence, but I stayed quiet. Ellery continued the presentation. Finally, he reached the governance clause. The removal of a founding operational partner without cause, he explained, activates a review of executive judgment under the company's ownership structure. Daniel let out a small laugh. This is ridiculous. Ellery didn't react. Instead, he slid a document across the table. This is the clause your father authorized 8 months before his passing. Daniel glanced at the page. For a moment, the confidence in his expression disappeared. What exactly are you suggesting? He asked. Ellery looked around the table before answering. That the board must now determine whether executive leadership acted in the company's best interest. Silence filled the room. One by one, the board members began asking questions. About vendor disputes, about delayed payments, about operational strain created by contracts the company wasn't fully prepared to fulfill. The conversation lasted almost an hour. Then the board chair cleared his throat. Given the evidence presented, he said slowly, we need to address the ownership conversion clause. Daniel sat up straighter. What clause? Ellery turned the final page in the folder. If executive leadership is found to have destabilized the company through negligent governance, he explained, controlling shares convert to the shareholder positioned to restore stability. Daniel's eyes moved quickly across the page. Then he looked at me. What does that mean? He demanded. Ellery answered calmly. It means that, effective immediately. He paused briefly. Mr. Michael Carter now holds 81% of Carter Industrial Group. The room went completely still. No one spoke. For a long moment, Daniel just stared at me like he was trying to understand how the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel victorious. I felt the weight of something much heavier. Responsibility. The boardroom emptied slowly after the decision. Chairs scraped against the floor. Papers were gathered into neat stacks. Quiet conversations drifted through the hallway as directors filtered out of the building. No one celebrated. Corporate power shifts rarely look dramatic from the outside. They happen in quiet rooms, through signatures and numbers on paper. But the consequences echo loudly afterward. I stayed seated at the table for a few minutes after everyone left, staring at the documents in front of me. 81% ownership. Even seeing the number printed clearly didn't feel real yet. The door clicked shut behind the last board member. Then I heard Daniel's chair move. You planned this, he said. I looked up. He was standing at the far side of the table, both hands resting on the polished wood surface. His voice wasn't loud. It was tight. No, I replied calmly. I didn't. He let out a sharp breath. Don't insult me. I'm not. Daniel shook his head and started pacing slowly along the edge of the room. You disappeared for weeks, he said. Then suddenly there's a legal review, a board vote, and now you own the company. He stopped and pointed toward the papers. That doesn't happen by accident. My father wrote the structure, I said. Convenient. It wasn't convenient, I replied quietly. It was protective. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. protective of you. I held his gaze. Of the company. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room felt thick, like the air before a storm breaks. Finally, Daniel leaned forward against the table. You could have talked to me, he said. I felt something shift inside me when he said that. Talk to you. I repeated. Yes. I let out a slow breath. You fired me in a parking lot after Dad's funeral. His eyes flickered slightly. That was business, he said. And this isn't. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room. The conference table, the empty chairs, the large window overlooking the warehouse floor where employees were finishing their shifts. This building had been part of our lives for years. Our father's entire adult life had lived inside these walls. I was trying to move the company forward, Daniel said finally. I know. You think Dad's way was the only way? No, I said. I think his way was careful. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You always thought you were smarter than everyone else here. That's not true. Then why take control? The question hung between us. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood and walked slowly toward the window. Down below, forklifts moved between loading docks. Workers closed warehouse doors for the evening. The company was still running, still moving, still alive. When I finally turned back toward him, my voice was steady. I didn't do this to beat you. Daniel frowned. Then why? Because the company was starting to slip. His jaw tightened. You don't know that. I do, I said gently. Vendors were already calling me. That surprised him. Why would they call you? Because for 10 years, I said, I was the person who solved their problems. The room went quiet again. Daniel looked down at the table, processing something he hadn't expected. After a moment, I spoke again. You're still part of this company, I said. His head snapped up. What? You built relationships here. I continued. You understand the sales side better than I do. Daniel narrowed his eyes. So what? I work for you now. I chose my words carefully. You work with the company. And under your control. Yes. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. No. The word came out firm. You'd really walk away from everything Dad built? I asked. I'm not working for my little brother. I'm not asking you to. Feels like you are. There was pride in his voice. And pride can be heavier than logic. Daniel grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. You wanted the company, he said as he walked toward the door. Congratulations. The door opened. Then he paused for just a second before leaving. You always did get the last word, he muttered. And then he was gone. The room fell silent again. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty chair where he had been sitting. Winning a conflict rarely feels the way people imagine it will. Sometimes it just leaves you standing in a quiet room, holding responsibility you never actually wanted. The first thing I learned about taking control of a company is that the paperwork happens fast. The consequences happen slower. 2 days after the board meeting, I sat in my father's old office for the first time as the person legally responsible for the business. The room looked almost exactly the way he had left it. Same oak desk, same framed industry awards along the wall, same faint scent of machine oil drifting up from the warehouse floor below. I hadn't changed anything. Not yet. The chair behind the desk felt heavier than I expected. Ellery had warned me that control transfers often create uncertainty inside a company. People worry about layoffs, leadership shifts, major restructuring. So the first thing I did was call an all-staff meeting. Nothing dramatic. Just the warehouse supervisors, department managers, and office staff gathered in the break area where my father used to make announcements. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Mark stood near the back with a few of the logistics crew. Several office managers sat at the folding tables with their laptops closed in front of them. They were waiting. I leaned lightly against the front counter instead of standing behind the small podium my father used to use. "I know the last few weeks have been confusing," I began. A few people nodded. "And I know there's probably a lot of speculation about what happens next." That earned a few small smiles. Office rumors had always moved faster than forklifts. "So let me start with the most important thing," I continued. "Nobody here is losing their job because of what happened in the boardroom." The tension in the room eased almost instantly. People didn't clap or react loudly, but shoulders relaxed. And that was enough. "The company's biggest problem right now isn't staffing," I said. "It's stability." Several managers leaned forward. "You've probably already felt it," I continued. "New contracts moving faster than our operations can support. Vendor agreements that don't match our logistics capacity." A few heads nodded more seriously now. "We're not canceling growth," I said, "but we're slowing it down." That meant reviewing the expansion contracts Daniel had signed. Some were salvageable with adjusted timelines. Others required difficult conversations. One afternoon, I sat on a call with a distribution partner who had been promised delivery capacity we simply didn't have yet. "We were told your new facility would be operational by next quarter," the executive said. "It won't be," I replied calmly. There was a long pause on the line. "But we can build toward that timeline together," I added. Some deals were renegotiated. A few were quietly withdrawn. The goal wasn't speed anymore. It was balance. Inside the company, I spent most of my time walking the floor instead of sitting in the office, talking to supervisors, listening to the warehouse teams, reviewing operations with department managers who had spent years keeping the machinery of the business running. One afternoon, Mark caught up with me near the loading docks. "Strange seeing you back in charge," he said with a small grin. "Strange for me, too." He glanced around the warehouse. "Feels a little steadier, though." That word stayed with me. Steadier. My father had always believed a company should move like a well-balanced machine, not fast for the sake of speed, but consistently enough that people trusted it. Over the next few months, the numbers began to reflect that philosophy again. Vendor relationships stabilized. Delayed payments were resolved. Logistics schedules returned to something predictable. The company didn't explode with growth the way Daniel had imagined, but it regained something more important: control. Late one evening, I sat alone in the office reviewing quarterly reports. The numbers were improving slowly, not dramatically, but steadily. For the first time since the funeral, the business felt like it was breathing normally again. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room. For most of my life, this office had belonged to my father. Now it belonged to the responsibility he had carried for decades. And for the first time, I understood why he had never taken that responsibility lightly. It was late autumn when I finally went back to the cemetery. The leaves had already started to turn, deep reds and gold scattered across the grass like quiet reminders that time keeps moving whether you're ready for it or not. I hadn't visited since the funeral. Not because I didn't want to, because the last few months had moved so quickly that grief had been quietly pushed to the side by responsibility. Running a company doesn't leave much space for reflection. But that afternoon, I left the office early and drove out there alone. The cemetery was quiet. Just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional crunch of gravel under distant footsteps. I walked slowly toward the section where my father was buried. His headstone was simple, exactly the way he would have wanted it. James Carter. Builder. Father. Friend. I stood there for a while before saying anything. It felt strange, talking out loud in an empty space. But eventually the words came. "Well," I said quietly, "things got complicated." The wind stirred the leaves near my feet. For months, I had been making decisions every day: contracts, staffing, operations, finances. But standing there in front of that stone made all of it feel smaller somehow. Because the company had never just been about numbers. It had been about people. The warehouse workers who had spent decades lifting shipments and keeping the logistics moving. The office staff who had memorized vendor accounts better than any spreadsheet could. The supervisors who knew every corner of the operation like it was part of their own homes. My father had built the company slowly over 30 years. Not by chasing headlines. By earning trust. "I think I understand what you were trying to protect now," I said. A few months earlier, I had thought control meant victory. That the board meeting had been the moment everything turned in my favor. But that wasn't really true. Because ownership doesn't feel like winning. It feels like weight. Every decision echoes through the lives of people who depend on the business staying healthy. And the strange part is, that weight had slowly started to feel familiar. Not comfortable, but meaningful. I thought about Daniel for a moment. We hadn't spoken since the day he walked out of the boardroom. At first I had expected anger, resentment, maybe even legal challenges. But none of that happened. Instead, there had just been silence. And maybe that silence said more than any argument could have. "I didn't beat him," I said quietly. The words surprised me a little as I spoke them. "I just stayed when he left." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves through the air. For years I had believed my father's greatest gift would be the company itself. The buildings, the contracts, the ownership shares. But standing there, I realized something different. Those things were just structures. What he had really passed down was responsibility. The understanding that stability matters more than recognition. That quiet leadership often protects more people than loud ambition ever could. And that protecting something valuable sometimes means carrying burdens you never asked for. I stood there a little longer before finally turning back toward the gravel path. As I walked away, one thought stayed with me. The real inheritance my father left behind wasn't control of the company. It was the obligation to take care of the people whose lives were tied to it. Sometimes I still think about that afternoon in the cemetery parking lot. Not the board meeting. Not the legal documents. Not even the moment the ownership numbers shifted. Just that quiet conversation beside a row of parked cars after my father's funeral. It's strange how the moments that feel small at the time end up defining everything that comes after. Back then, I remember standing there in my black suit, still feeling the weight of the funeral service, when Daniel looked at me and said my role at the company was no longer necessary. The sentence had felt surreal. For years I had believed my place in the company was secure, not because of family ties, but because of the work itself. The late nights fixing operational problems. The systems we built. The relationships we maintained with suppliers and logistics partners. I thought that kind of effort created permanence. But life has a way of reminding you that nothing is permanent. Not positions. Not expectations. Sometimes not even family alliances. Losing the job that afternoon had felt like losing the last connection to my father's life work. At the time, I thought that was the end of the story. What I didn't realize was that it was actually the beginning of something more complicated. Because when the ownership structure surfaced, when the board meeting happened, when the responsibility of running the company landed squarely on my shoulders, I had to confront a question I'd never really asked before. Who was I without the title I had spent years earning? For a while, the answer wasn't clear. Control of the company didn't magically bring clarity or satisfaction. If anything, it created more pressure. More decisions. More people relying on the stability of something I was now responsible for protecting. But over time, something shifted. Not dramatically, just quietly. The company began to move in a steady rhythm again. Vendors returned to predictable schedules. Employees stopped whispering in the hallways about sudden changes. The warehouse floor sounded the way it always had: busy, organized, reliable. And in those ordinary moments, I started to understand something about my father that I had missed for years. Leadership wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It wasn't about proving you deserved control. It was about creating an environment where other people could do their work without fear that everything might collapse around them. That kind of leadership rarely gets attention, but it keeps entire communities functioning. I still drive past the cemetery, sometimes on my way home from the office. Every once in a while I stop for a few minutes, not to ask questions, just to sit there quietly and remember the man who built something strong enough to survive conflict, ambition, and even family disagreements. Because in the end, the company didn't belong to me. Not really. It belonged to the people who showed up every morning to keep it running. My job was simply to make sure they still had a place to show up to. And strangely enough, that responsibility feels more valuable than ownership ever did. Family and business can be a complicated mix. Have you ever seen a family conflict completely change someone's life or career? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every story, and this community often has the most powerful perspectives. And if you enjoy thoughtful, emotional storytelling about family, legacy, and life-changing moments, consider subscribing to American Granny Stories for more real-life narratives like this.